I was standing in my dark kitchen at 1:15 in the morning, staring at the tiny blue light on my phone like it might explain why my life had suddenly gone wrong. When it buzzed, I answered on the first ring because late-night calls from your daughter don't mean anything good. Sarah was crying so hard I could barely make out her words, and I remember gripping the counter so tightly my knuckles went pale. "Dad." "It's on the front page," she kept saying, broken up by sobs I could feel in my chest. "They're saying your name. They're saying you were left behind after the rescue." For a second, I honestly thought I had misunderstood her. The refrigerator hummed behind me. The house was silent. And then the meaning of what she said landed all at once, heavy as a casket lid, cold as the January window over my sink. "I'm Arthur Vance. I'm 68 years old. I live in a quiet subdivision outside Columbus. And for most of my life, I thought I understood what it meant to be needed. I raised Sarah alone after her mother passed, worked double shifts, packed her lunches, showed up to every school concert and every ugly little emergency life could throw at us. I wasn't perfect, but I was there. That was the one thing I never questioned. Not once. So when Sarah's voice started shaking harder, I kept thinking this had to be a mistake. Some headline twisted by people who didn't know the truth. But she wasn't speaking like someone correcting a rumor. She sounded scared, embarrassed too. And underneath all of it, I heard something that made my stomach turn, as if she were already standing too far away from me to reach. Then she said in one ragged breath that people were seeing my name while the whole country watched. And I knew before she even finished crying that this was bigger than a bad article, bigger than a misunderstanding. Something had been done to me, and my own daughter was the one calling to tell me I was the last person to know. 12 hours earlier, I was sitting in my car outside Sarah's house in a quiet subdivision on the edge of Columbus, watching rain bead and slide down the windshield, like the whole world was trying not to look at me. Thanksgiving lights were glowing in the front windows. I could smell roasted turkey every time her front door opened, and for one foolish second, I still thought I might be asked inside. Instead, Sarah kept smoothing her sweater and avoiding my eyes, like if she didn't meet my face, she could keep this simple. Harmless, temporary. Julian Mercer had apparently decided he needed to step up this year, and Sarah said it in that careful voice people use when they want you to swallow something bitter without making a scene. She told me it would be easier if I sat this one out. Easier for who I kept wondering. Not for me. Not for the man who had spent years showing up, paying bills when it mattered, and being the one she called when life turned sharp. But I heard the plea underneath her words, and I hated how quickly I still reached for her comfort, even when she was the one asking me to shrink. So I told her I understood. I said I wanted peace for her. I said I didn't want to make the evening awkward. Those were the right words, the safe words, the ones good fathers use when they're trying not to become a burden in their own child's life. But the second she nodded too fast, I felt something inside me fold in on itself, like a map being creased until all the roads disappeared. On the way back home, I kept both hands on the wheel and stared straight ahead, because if I looked at that house one more time, I might not trust myself to leave. At a red light, I noticed my reflection in the glass. An older man with rain on his shoulders and a smile he had to talk himself into wearing. I remember thinking that respect should not feel like asking permission to exist. That thought sat in my chest like a stone. Before I got out of the car, I reached into the passenger seat and picked up the silver surgical set I'd saved for Sarah. I'd cleaned it, wrapped it, and told myself it was the kind of gift she'd understand someday. A piece of my life handed over with hope. I left it on her porch anyway, right beside the mat where she couldn't miss it. Then I drove off without waiting for her to find it, because I already knew what that silence meant. And I wasn't ready to hear it yet. The garage smelled like wet concrete and old cardboard, and I sat on a folding chair under the weak yellow bulb, like I was waiting for my own life to make sense again. I kept telling myself I was fine. I had spent years in an operating room, years keeping my hands steady. while everybody else panicked, so I should have been able to sit with a little rain and a little humiliation without falling apart. But my chest felt tight every time I remembered Sarah's face turning away from mine at that porch, as if I were the one asking for a favor I had no right to want. That was the part I hated most. Not just that she chose Julian's comfort over my place at the table, but that some childish part of me still wanted her to look at me and say I mattered. I sat there staring at the toolbox by my feet and felt ridiculous for needing approval from my own daughter. Then I felt angry at myself for even calling it approval, because what I wanted was simpler than that. I wanted to be treated like I belonged. I opened the silver case one latch at a time, slow and careful, like the box itself might accuse me of being sentimental. Inside each instrument lay in its slot exactly the way I had left it, polished and silent, a whole row of things built to solve emergencies when everyone else had already given up. I checked them one by one, not because I expected to use them in my garage, but because when something hurts, I've always believed, you name it, record it, keep the evidence. If I lied to myself now, I'd only give the injury room to grow teeth. My phone lit up on the workbench twice while I was still staring into that case. I didn't answer either time. I just saved the messages, then the voicemail, then the next text that came in, with that careful, polished tone people use when they want access without accountability. Sarah said I was making things tense. Julian left a message that sounded almost polite if you ignored the pressure underneath it. I kept every one of them and said nothing back. The silence felt heavy, but it also felt clean, like finally closing a door and hearing what had been outside all along. By midnight, the garage was so quiet I could hear rain tapping the roof in a steady rhythm like a clock that had stopped caring about me. I put the case back on the shelf and looked at my phone again, thumb hovering over the screen. I had spent my whole life fixing what I could reach. This time I was starting to understand that the first thing I needed to protect was myself. And then the next message came in and it made my stomach turn. Route 33 was lit up like a bad memory I couldn't look away from. I had been driving home from the free clinic with my old medical kit on the passenger seat, tired, in that deep bone-level way that makes even the steering wheel feel heavy when the road ahead just ended. Flashers, crumpled metal, people standing in the rain with their hands over their mouths. The landslide had come down hard enough to pin a tour van in the middle of the mess, and for one strange second, I thought, not this, not tonight. Then my body moved before my fear could catch up. I parked crooked and got out into the wet cold. Nobody was giving speeches. Nobody was pretending to be brave. They were just staring at the wreckage like it might explain itself. I remember hearing somebody say there was a little girl inside, and that was it for me. I ducked under a twisted frame, ducked through broken space, and crawled toward the sound of a child trying to breathe through panic. All the training I had ever done narrowed to one thing: keep her steady, keep her open, keep her here. My hands knew what to do before my mind finished trembling. The kit felt suddenly ancient in my palm, like I had carried it through 1,000 lives, and this one was the only one that mattered. I worked beside the flicker of emergency lights, talking low, telling her to look at me, to count, with me to stay with my voice. My right hand caught against shattered glass at one point, and the sting made my vision go white for half a second, but I didn't stop. Pain is strange. When somebody else's breathing is hanging by a thread, it becomes background noise. It becomes weather. And I had spent too many years learning how to keep going in bad weather. When the paramedics finally got to us, I was sitting in the rain with my sleeve darkened and my hand wrapped in a towel somebody had shoved at me. I should have felt heroic. I didn't. I just felt used up. And oddly clear, like all the lies I'd been swallowing had finally been washed off by the storm. A reporter came up with a mic and asked if my family was waiting for me. I heard myself answer before I even meant to. I said Sarah had told me not to come. The words hung there bare and sharp, and I watched the reporter's face change. I thought that would be the end of it. Just another exhausted sentence lost in a night of sirens and mud. I drove home with my hand throbbing and my mind too tired to invent the future. But somewhere behind me, that little clip was already being passed around, and by morning I was going to learn how fast a private wound can turn into public fire. By morning, my face was on every screen I passed. The local news Facebook, even the checkout line at Kroger, where a woman in front of me pretended not to stare, and then absolutely stared. I stood there with a carton of milk in my hand, my phone buzzing in my pocket like it had nerves of its own, and I felt something strange. Not triumph, not shame either. Just this hollow, bright exhaustion, like I had been sleepwalking, and somebody finally turned on the kitchen light. Julian called first. Of course he did. His voice came through smooth and careful, the way a man sounds when he's trying to sound calm for an audience he can't see. He said it was all being taken out of context, that people only heard a fragment, that I understood how media works. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence sit there between us, because silence makes polished people nervous. And sure enough, he rushed to fill it. He talked about misunderstanding, about stress, about how everybody was under pressure. Not once did he ask if I was okay. That told me more than his whole speech. Sarah called twice before noon. The first time I let it ring until voicemail picked up. The second time, I watched her name light up the screen and felt my chest tighten the way it always did when I hoped she might finally say the right thing. But she didn't leave a real message. She sent a text instead. Just one line. We need to keep this private. That was the moment I understood she wasn't reaching for me. She was reaching for the fire extinguisher. My daughter was trying to put out the smoke without ever looking for the match. I set the phone face down and sat at my kitchen table with my coffee gone cold. For a minute, I almost laughed at how tired I was. People imagine revenge feels like fireworks. Sometimes it feels like being too drained to even flinch. I had spent so many years making myself small that getting seen this loudly should have felt like justice. Instead, it felt like standing in the rain after everyone else had gone inside. Then Denise Porter called. I had known her long enough to hear the shift in her voice before she said a word. She didn't waste time on sympathy. She asked me to replay the clip and listen for one specific sentence. Arthur, she said, the reporter didn't just hear a family story. He heard a public statement that could open a legal door. I sat up so fast my chair scraped the floor. She went on, careful and calm, telling me the clip had landed in a way I hadn't understood yet. Not just on the news, but somewhere people like Julian couldn't control. And when Denise said, I think you need to come see me, I realized this wasn't over. Not even close. Denise's office sat 2 blocks from the courthouse in a building that smelled like old paper-burnt coffee and winter coats drying by the heater. I remember standing there with my hands jammed in my pockets, suddenly feeling like a man who had carried a cracked plate across the room for months and only now realized it was leaking all over my life. When Denise opened her door, she did not give me pity. She gave me a chair and a yellow legal pad, and somehow that felt kinder. I started talking too fast at first. Thanksgiving. Sarah's sudden tone changes Julian's careful questions that always circled back to money without ever touching it directly. I watched Denise's face while I spoke. She didn't interrupt. She just made small notes, one line at a time, the way a doctor reads a monitor after everyone else in the room has stopped breathing and started hoping. Then she asked me to show her the emails. That was the moment my stomach tightened, because once I handed over my phone, the mess in my head stopped being private. She leaned back and read in silence. I could hear the radiator clicking. I could hear my own pulse. Then she said, Julian had been putting pressure on Sarah's accounts in a way that made her uneasy, and when she pointed to the messages about a power of attorney, I felt something in me go cold and sharp at the same time. It wasn't just the holiday. It wasn't even just the money. It was the pattern. The slow, polite reaching for the keys while everyone kept pretending the door was still locked. Denise looked at me over her glasses and told me to stop explaining myself to people who were already benefiting from my confusion. "Keep quiet. Keep copies. Let him keep talking," she said. Her voice was steady, almost flat, and I hated how much I needed that steadiness. It felt like being handed a seatbelt after I had already been skidding on black ice. But I nodded, because for the first time in a long time, I could see the road. When I left her office, the courthouse loomed down the block like a house with all its lights on. I kept my hands on the envelope she gave me the whole walk back to the car. I knew then that if Julian thought I was still just the wounded old father trying to keep the peace, he had already made his first mistake. And I wondered how long it would take him to realize I was no longer speaking in circles. Sarah came up my front walk slowly, like the porch itself might accuse her. For one stupid second, I let myself believe she was here, because she had finally run out of excuses. I even caught myself noticing how the evening light softened the siding, how normal the whole house looked from the outside. As if anything inside me had stayed normal after Thanksgiving. She stood in my doorway, without Julian, without the polished little smile he always wore like a tie pin, and that should have told me something. Instead, she folded her hands and started talking too fast the way people do when they want the truth to sound like a favor. Julian's investment fund had a shortfall, not a small one. She said it like she was discussing a broken dishwasher, like numbers could be rinsed off and put back in place if I would just step in and make it easy. I listened. I let the silence do its work. The thing about loving your child is that you learn their faces the way other people learn maps. I could see the exact moment she expected me to soften. Her shoulders eased just a little when I didn't interrupt. That was the part that hurt most. How quickly she reached for me when she needed something, and how carefully she stepped around me when I needed honesty. It felt like being handed an empty frame and being told to call it family. She kept talking about temporary problems, about timing, about how we could help them bridge the gap. There it was, we. That little word she used when she wanted my money to sound like a family value instead of a rescue line. I remembered all the times I'd covered a bill, patched a leak, kept quiet, so nobody had to feel uncomfortable. I had been acting like a safety net so long, I think they forgot I was a person underneath it. Then I asked her one question. No lecture, no raised voice. Just one question quiet enough to make her stop breathing for a second. Did you come here as my daughter or as Julian's messenger? It landed hard. I watched her face go blank first, then red, then frightened like a curtain had dropped, and she had to decide whether to keep performing. Her eyes filled, but she still didn't answer. She just kept pressing her lips together, and I could see the answer living in that silence. I had never seen silence look so expensive. Then she started crying, and I realized I was still waiting for the part where she chose me. After Sarah left, the house felt too clean, like the air had been scrubbed of every honest thing. I stood in the kitchen for a long time with my phone in my hand, staring at the family group chat as if it might change its mind and turn kind again. It didn't. So I did the first thing I had done for myself in years. I blocked it. My thumb shook when I tapped the screen, and I hated that part the most, not the action, but how foreign it felt to choose myself without asking permission. Then I opened my banking app and looked at the automatic transfer I'd been sending every month to their mortgage account. I had always told myself it was temporary, just until they got settled, just until things were easier, just until I stopped feeling like a father who had to prove he was useful to stay loved. That was the lie I had been living inside. I canceled it. The confirmation screen felt colder than I expected, like a door locking somewhere deep in my chest. I sat down at the table afterward and let the silence settle around me. It was ugly. It was necessary. I moved my direct deposit alerts to my own phone next because I was tired of learning about my own money secondhand, like I was being informed of weather in a city I no longer lived in. That small change hit me harder than I wanted to admit. It meant I was watching my life with my own eyes again. No Julian. No Sarah. No one else standing between me and the numbers that should have belonged to me all along. By afternoon, I had called Denise Porter and made an appointment to update my will and trust. Saying it out loud made my throat tighten. I knew what I was doing. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was drawing a line so clear that even my own guilt couldn't blur it. Still, the guilt came anyway. Quiet, familiar, almost polite. It sat beside me like an old habit in church clothes telling me I was being harsh, ungrateful, difficult. But I had spent too many years confusing kindness with surrender. I looked around my kitchen and realized boundaries are a lot like building a wall in a storm. You don't do it because you want to be alone. You do it because you finally understand what keeps washing through the open door. And as I set the pen down after scheduling that appointment, I knew one thing for certain. Julian would feel this first, but I needed to know what Sarah would do when she realized the safety net was gone. The parking lot looked ordinary enough to fool a person. Beige asphalt, a row of parked sedans, a cart corral pushed crooked in the wind. That was the part that made my stomach tighten. Men like Julian always preferred ordinary places, because nothing in the setting was supposed to feel dangerous. He stepped in front of me like we were about to have a normal conversation, wearing that polished smile he saved for neighbors, bankers, and anyone he thought he could out-talk. "Sarah's overwhelmed," he said like he was doing me a favor by translating her silence. "You need to stop embarrassing the family with that news story." I remember the way my hand stayed on my grocery bag handle, white-knuckled and still. I had spent too many years making myself smaller around people like him, but this time I heard my own voice land steady. "I'm not the one telling half-truths, Julian." That was all it took for his smile to thin. He started talking faster after that, which told me more than his words did. He said I was making things harder than they needed to be. He said Sarah was stressed. He said this was all being blown out of proportion, and if I really loved my daughter, I would let it go. I watched him perform concern the way some men perform prayer at church, loud enough for the room, empty enough to slip through your fingers. And then I mentioned Denise, and not dramatically, just her name casual as a receipt I'd already tucked away. I also told him the documents were signed. His face changed so quickly, I almost missed it. The color drained out of him, then came back wrong, sharp and angry, and then just as fast, he put the mask on again. That tiny flicker, that was the crack. I knew that look. I had seen it before in operating rooms, when a calm voice suddenly realized the chart didn't match the story. People like Julian hate one thing more than being questioned, being measured. He thought I was still the kind of man who would fold if he raised his voice a little, if he sounded disappointed enough, if he made me feel like the problem. But I wasn't standing there with an open heart anymore. I was standing there with a ledger in my mind, and every entry had a date. The rain had started again, soft and thin, tapping on my windshield, like it wanted to get in on the truth. Julian kept talking, but I was already watching the space between his words. That was where the fear lived. And once I saw it, I knew he would do something foolish soon. Denise spread the copies across her desk like she was laying cards face up in a game somebody else had rigged. The room near the courthouse smelled like old coffee and printer toner, and I remember thinking that if betrayal had a smell, it would be something just like that. Stale, ordinary, almost clean enough to lie about. I sat there with my hands folded so tight my knuckles ached, watching her line up the transfers, the texts, the emails. Page after page. Quiet proof. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that looked evil at first glance. That was the part that made my stomach turn. Denise didn't talk to me like I was fragile, and I needed that more than comfort. She pointed to the same patterns over and over, the same account numbers, the same rushed wording, the same little nudges that tried to sound helpful, while moving Sarah closer to a signature she clearly hadn't studied. "This isn't a misunderstanding, Arthur," she said, and her voice stayed calm enough to make the truth land harder. I stared at one email where Julian had written that Sarah didn't need to worry her pretty head about the paperwork. I felt my face go hot. Pretty head? That kind of sentence is a velvet rope stretched across a cliff. I had spent years thinking family trouble looked loud. Raised voices, slammed doors, someone crying in the kitchen. What I was looking at now was something colder. A spreadsheet can look innocent until you realize it's been used like a map. I kept thinking about how easily love gets used as a key. How someone can slide into your life smiling and leave fingerprints on everything you own. Denise let me sit with that for a minute, then she slid a blank report form toward me and told me to let the facts do the talking. So I signed. My hand shook, but not from doubt. From the weight of finally naming what had been circling my life for months. Once the copies were filed, I felt something settle inside me. Not peace exactly, but footing. Like I had been standing in wet sand and finally found packed ground beneath it. Denise said the report would stay quiet unless it had to move. That mattered. Quiet could be power if the other side thought you were still empty-handed. I did not tell Sarah a word, because I needed Julian to keep reaching. And I needed to see what kind of man he became when he thought the room had no exits. The call from Denise came while I was rinsing a coffee mug at the sink, and the sound of her voice told me before the words did. She was careful. Too careful. That was how I knew Julian had finally stepped wrong. "Arthur, do not react yet," she said, and I stood there with my hand in the warm water, staring at my own reflection in the window over the basin, like it belonged to somebody else. She told me the document had moved faster than it should have, with Sarah's name on a property transfer she had barely understood, and there was an inconsistency in the wording that did not belong in a clean file. One line had the wrong sequence. One signature page did not match the rest. It was the kind of mistake a man makes when he is in too much of a hurry to notice he has left his own fingerprints on the glass. I remember the strange calm that came over me after that. Not relief. More like the moment before a storm breaks when the air turns heavy and the birds go silent all at once. Denise asked if I still had every copy. I told her I had them in the folder she told me to keep, plus the texts, the emails, the notes I had taken from memory, because I had learned the hard way that people who lie in writing usually trip over the details later. She said, "Bring everything." So I did. No hesitation, no dramatic speech. Just me laying out the paper trail on her conference table, like I was sorting parts after a wreck, except this time the wreck had a name, a polished smile, and a habit of talking over my daughter until she forgot what she had agreed to. I did not go with her when the investigators arrived at Julian's office, but I heard enough later to picture it. The timing was perfect, almost cruel in how perfect it was. Julian had been in the middle of one of his usual performances, the smooth voice, the confident posture, the kind of man who looks like he thinks rules are for other people. Then the questions started. Then the color left his face. Then came that awful quiet that falls over a room when people realize the story they believed is already falling apart. Denise told me coworkers started looking at him differently before he even finished answering. That is the part that stayed with me. Not the panic, the exposure. A man like Julian can live on charm for a long time, but charm is just a thin coat of paint when the wood underneath is rotten. I should have felt triumph. Maybe some part of me wanted to. But what I mostly felt was the cold, clean ache of being proved right too late. He had spent months making Sarah doubt my voice, making my name sound like a problem she had to manage. Now his own paperwork was speaking in a language he could not interrupt. And for the first time in a long time, I could see the shape of the trap closing around him. But I still did not know how far he would go when he realized he had nowhere left to hide. When Sarah came back to my house, she didn't walk in like my daughter anymore. She hovered in the doorway like someone waiting for the floor to give way. The air between us felt thin, almost brittle. She kept rubbing her hands together, staring at the rug instead of at me, and I knew she had already heard enough at Julian's office to start questioning the story she had been living inside. That kind of silence is its own kind of noise, loud enough to make the whole room feel crowded. I didn't reach for her. I didn't start with anger. I just sat down at the kitchen table and spread everything out in front of me. The texts, the email threads, the transfer requests, the dates lined up so cleanly they looked cruel. I watched her eyes move across the page, watched her mouth tighten when she saw her own name folded into decisions she never would have made on purpose. It was like watching fog lift off a windshield all at once. Slow, then sudden, then impossible to ignore, she kept saying, "That can't be right. Not to me." To herself. I could see her trying to hold the old version of him in place, trying to make the facts fit the face she had trusted. I knew that feeling too well. It's the mental habit of someone who has been asked to doubt their own memory so many times that truth starts arriving like an unwelcome guest. So I let the papers speak. I let the timeline sit there between us like a straight road she could finally see all the way down. When she found the message where he had coached her into signing without asking enough questions, her face changed in a way I will never forget. Not dramatic, just a small collapse around the eyes, like something inside her had finally given up pretending. She looked up at me then, and her voice came out cracked and small. "Were you planning this all along?" It wasn't accusation exactly. It was fear. The fear of realizing the person she had been calling unstable might have been the only one telling the truth. I could have softened it. I could have made myself smaller for her comfort like I used to. But I was done doing that. I was planning to survive it, I said. And the strange thing was, once I said it out loud, I felt my shoulders lower for the first time in months. She stared at me like she had just learned the difference between protection and punishment. And then she asked the one question I had been waiting for, but not hoping for. The moment Julian opened his mouth, I knew he had rehearsed every word in the mirror and still hadn't learned how to sound innocent. He sat there in that courtroom with his shoulders drawn up, trying to look worn down, trying to look like I was some bitter old man who couldn't let go. I kept my hands folded in my lap and watched him perform for people who could now see what I had spent months feeling in my gut. Denial is a strange costume. It always looks worse under fluorescent lights. Denise sat beside me with her files lined up like little bricks of truth. When she started walking the judge through the records, the room changed. Not all at once, just enough for me to feel it. The dates, the signatures that didn't match, the emails that circled around Sarah like a net and kept nudging her farther from me. I could almost hear Julian's plan losing shape one page at a time, like a house made of wet cardboard. He tried to interrupt, of course. He said I was confused. He said I was emotional. He even said Sarah had wanted distance from me, like that excuse could erase the trail he'd left behind. I didn't look at him when he said it. I looked at the judge because that was the only face in the room that mattered now. There's a quiet kind of power in refusing to scramble when someone else is drowning in their own story. Then Denise produced the timeline for the transfer requests, and I saw the exact second Julian realized the room was no longer his. The judge's expression tightened. He asked where the notarized originals were, then why Sarah's signature appeared on documents she had never been given time to understand. Julian started talking faster, which was exactly the wrong thing to do. Every answer made the next question sharper. I sat there breathing slowly, feeling my pulse in my throat, and for once I did not rush to save anyone from consequences. When the judge ordered a full review of the transfers and referred the matter to the prosecutor, the silence was so complete it felt almost physical. Julian's hand trembled on the table. Just a small movement. But I saw it. I saw the crack run straight through him. Not because I needed revenge. Because truth has a way of standing up in the middle of a room and making everyone else look small. I thought that would be the end of the worst part. It wasn't. Not even close. By the time I walked into the church fellowship hall, the room already felt different. Not louder, just tighter. The kind of tight you feel in your jaw before you even know why. Folding tables were lined with coffee urns, casseroles, and paper plates, and everybody was doing that polite fundraiser smile people wear when they want to look generous without getting too involved. Julian was in his element at first, moving from donor to donor with that polished little laugh of his, acting like charm could varnish over anything. But I could see it now. That smile had a hairline crack running straight through it, and every handshake seemed to press on it. I stayed near the wall and let the room reveal itself. That was the only power I had left in that moment, watching. One of the board members, a man in a navy blazer who had been smiling too hard all evening, stopped laughing halfway through Julian's story and glanced down at his phone again. Then another woman leaned in. Close said something I couldn't hear, and her expression changed so fast it was almost surgical. No big scene, no dramatic announcement, just a slow, horrible understanding spreading across the room like ink in water. I knew the exact second Julian felt it because his shoulders went stiff and his voice got a little too bright. He kept talking anyway. That was the mistake. He tried to explain the court notice, like it was a misunderstanding. Then the transfers, like they were family logistics. Then Sarah, like she was overwhelmed. Then me, like I was confused. Each sentence sounded less like an answer and more like a man building a wall out of wet cardboard. People nodded, but not the way they do when they believe you. More like they were watching him trip over his own shoelaces and waiting to see if he'd get up with any dignity left. Sarah stood beside him, perfectly still, her face pale under the church lights. I could see her trying to hold herself together, but it was like watching somebody realize the floor under their house is made of dust. I didn't step in. I didn't rescue him from the room he had been so eager to impress. I just stood there, quiet, and let the silence do what it does when the truth is already inside it. One board member finally said very calmly, "Julian, we need to revisit everything." And that was when I saw it, the exact moment he understood he had lost the room, the money, and the version of himself he'd been selling. But what he didn't know yet was that the worst part had not even started. Because once a crowd stops pretending, where do liars go next? The paper felt too light for what it was doing to my life. I sat across from Denise in her office near the courthouse, my hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee I had already gone cold. She slid the trust documents toward me with that steady, practical calm of hers, like she was helping me fasten a seatbelt before a long drive. My signature looked smaller than I remembered, but my decision did not. I had spent years building the free clinic and the scholarship fund with the same stubborn pride I used to bring home from surgery. I wanted those dollars to keep doing something useful after I was gone from the room, to pay for medicine, to pay for textbooks, to give somebody's kid a chance I never had to beg for. When I told Denise I wanted every last thing I owned to go there, her eyes softened for just a second. She said very quietly, "That's your legacy, Arthur." And I almost laughed because legacy sounds noble until you realize it also means choosing who gets left out. My hand was shaking when I picked up the pen. Not because I doubted myself. I knew exactly what I was doing. What shook me was the part I couldn't separate from the choice. Sarah. I could already feel the hollow space where her expectation had been like pulling a family photo out of a frame and seeing the outline remain on the wall. I still loved her enough to grieve what this would cost her. That was the brutal truth I had to sit with. Love and permission are not the same thing. Denise didn't rush me. She let the silence breathe until it stopped feeling like judgment and started feeling like dignity. Then I signed. One line, then another. Each one felt like I was taking back a piece of myself from people who had mistaken my generosity for availability. I remembered every time I had been the convenient answer, the man who would smooth things over, the one they only noticed when something needed paying for. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. When I set the pen down, my chest hurt, in that tired human way that comes after you finally stop lying to yourself. Denise gathered the pages and told me everything was in order. I nodded, but I was looking past the glass wall at the traffic moving along the street, thinking how strange it was that the whole world could keep going while one family quietly changed shape. I was not choosing money over my daughter. I was choosing not to hand my dignity to people who treated me like an optional guest. And when I stood up to leave, Denise said one thing that made me stop cold. "Are you ready for what Sarah will do when she learns this?" When she came back, I knew before I even opened the door that this was not the same Sarah who used to run through my kitchen in her socks and ask if I had packed her apple slices. She stood there on my porch with her hands wrapped around her elbows like she was trying to keep herself together against the evening air. The house behind me felt quieter than usual, every room listening. I let her stand in that silence a second longer than I normally would have, because I needed her to feel what months of being set aside had sounded like. She asked if there was anything she could do to change my mind. No speech, no tears at first. Just that one careful question, like she was stepping around broken glass she had helped scatter. I almost told her there was nothing left to say, but the truth rose up cleaner than my anger ever had. I told her apologies mean nothing when they only arrive after consequences do. Words are easy when the room has already caught fire. It is the door you were willing to open before that tells me who you are. Her face changed in slow motion. That was the hardest part. For a second, she looked so young, I could almost smell school buses and marker ink and the warm crust of grilled cheese sandwiches. I saw the little girl who used to sit on my lap while I tied her shoes and signed permission slips with a coffee mug balanced on the counter. My chest tightened so hard I had to look past her shoulder, because loving a child and letting them hurt you can live in the same body and tear it apart in different ways. I let myself breathe before I answered again. I thought about the porch in the rain, about standing in that cold, while she avoided my eyes, and about the Thanksgiving chair that stayed empty, so someone else could feel important. Those memories did something my loneliness never could. They organized the pain. They made it clear. A man can forgive a lot, but he cannot keep calling disrespect a misunderstanding just because family says it softly. Sarah started crying, then not loudly, just enough to make her voice shake, when she asked if I had ever planned to shut her out completely. I looked at her and told her the part she did not want to hear. I had planned to protect myself. There is a difference she should have learned before it came to this. Then I reached for the door handle, and I could see she still hoped I would soften. But I already had the one answer that mattered. The first sign that Julian was losing control was not some dramatic confession. It was silence. The kind that sits on a phone like a dead weight. His calls stopped going through to the people he used to brag about at dinner. The investors who had once laughed too loudly at his jokes started answering with vague, polite phrases that meant one thing in America: they were done. I did not need anyone to translate it for me. I had seen enough men built on borrowed confidence to know that once the handshakes stop, the whole structure starts to tilt. I caught the rest in pieces the way you catch a storm through a window before the rain reaches your street. A post here, a desperate comment there. Julian trying to sound calm, trying to sound wronged, trying to sound like a man above it all while the comments under his own words kept turning colder by the hour. Every time he explained himself, he made the circle tighter. Every time he reached for sympathy, he left another fingerprint. I sat there with my coffee growing lukewarm and thought about how people like him never understand that a polished lie still cracks when you keep rubbing it in the light. What got me was how fast his whole image fell apart once shame touched it. He had spent so long acting powerful that he looked allergic to being seen plainly. I think that is what made him dangerous in the first place. Not strength, but the panic underneath it. Men like Julian do not know how to stand still when the room stops applauding. They start talking louder, posting harder, smiling wider, until the strain shows in every line of their face. I knew that look. I had seen it in operating rooms, in boardrooms, in church basements. The mask always slips where the mirror is honest. I did not feel joy. Not really. Just a hard, quiet relief. The kind that comes when a fever finally breaks and you realize you are not crazy for feeling sick. I had spent months being made to doubt my own eyes, my own gut, my own memory. Watching Julian unravel did not heal any of that, but it confirmed the part I needed most. I had not imagined the cruelty. He really had been cutting corners with my trust circling my daughter, like a man looking for the easiest way into a locked house. And now the doors were closing on him one by one. By the time the last call I knew about went unanswered, I understood something simple and brutal. Justice does not always arrive with sirens or speeches. Sometimes it just sits in the background patient as a courthouse clerk and keeps the receipts. And the part I could not stop thinking about was this. If he was already panicking now, what would he do when he realized nobody was left to catch him? The new apartment felt too small the first time I unlocked the door, like my whole life had been folded down to fit inside 4 quiet walls. But when I carried in the last box and set it by the window, I realized small was not the same as empty. It was just honest. I had traded the echoing house for a place near the clinic close enough that I could walk in the morning and hear the city wake up around me instead of waking up to my own thoughts. That mattered more than I expected. I had spent so long living in rooms that belonged to other people's expectations. This felt like mine. I gave away most of the furniture before the movers could even finish asking where I wanted things placed. The couch went to a retired nurse on my street who had brought me casseroles when I could barely stand the smell of my own kitchen. The dining table went to a young couple with a baby who kept thanking me like I was doing them a favor, and maybe I was. But I needed the space more than I needed the wooden nails. Every chair I passed along felt like I was loosening another finger from a hand that had held me too tightly for too long. I slept better that week than I had in months. That first night I sat at my bare table with a mug of coffee and no television on, and the silence did not accuse me. It just sat beside me. I remember looking at the steam curling up from the cup and thinking that peace can feel almost unfamiliar when you have only known being on guard. My phone stayed face down. No waiting. No bracing myself. Just one simple meal, and the strange, steady feeling that I did not need anybody's permission to exist in my own life. Then Sarah texted. One last message. Short. Careful. The kind of message that tries to sound soft while still asking for access. I read it once, and my thumb hovered over the screen the way it used to hover over her contact name, ready to forgive, before I had even heard enough. I did not answer. That was the part that would have broken me once. Not now. Emotional debt had nearly turned my life into a revolving door, and I was done letting anyone collect interest on my kindness. I put the phone down and let it stay there. The records were still in my folder. The boundaries were still in place. The life I had kept for everyone else was finally back in my hands. But what if the quiet was only the beginning? The silence in my little apartment had a different shape than the silence I used to live with. Back then it felt like waiting, like I was always one phone call away from being needed, blamed, or pulled back into somebody else's emergency. Now it just sounded like my own life settling into place. I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold beside me, and I realized I was no longer bracing for the next request. That alone felt like breathing after years of holding my chest tight. I kept thinking about Sarah, and that was the part nobody likes to admit out loud. I did not stop loving her because I drew a line. I stopped letting love make me easy to use. That distinction had cost me more tears than I wanted to count, because grief is strange that way. It does not leave just because you finally do the right thing. It follows you around the rooms of your life quiet, as a shadow reminding you what you lost and what you refused to lose with it. I used to believe a good parent had to keep giving no matter what. More money, more chances, more silence when silence kept the peace. I thought that made me strong, but it only made me convenient. Once I understood that everything changed. I could miss my daughter and still refuse to hand her the keys to my dignity. I could wish her well and still protect my accounts, my home, and my name. That was not cold. That was me finally treating my own life like it mattered. Some nights I still reached for my phone before I remembered I did not have to. Old habits do not vanish just because you have the truth on your side. But the hand stopped halfway now. That was the difference. I no longer mistook an empty space for an invitation. I no longer treated guilt like a command. What I learned was simple, and it took me far too long to learn it. Loving my child did not mean surrendering myself to be consumed. Protecting myself was not cruelty. It was the first honest thing I had done in years. And when I sat there in the quiet, with nothing demanding that I shrink, I understood something I never thought I would say. I had lost a piece of my family, but I had found my way back to myself. When the judge finally finished reading the sanctions, the room went so quiet I could hear my own breathing. Julian's lawyer stood there with that polished, certain expression he had worn like armor for months, and then it cracked right down the middle. The judge referred his conduct for review, ordered the transfers unwound, and made it plain that this case had wasted the court's time and tried to bend facts into something they were never meant to be. Julian looked at the table in front of him like it had betrayed him. For the first time, I watched him with nothing left to give him, not anger, not pity, not a single extra ounce of my life. Denise touched my arm as we stood to leave, and I could tell by the silence in that courtroom that everyone understood the same thing I did. I had not lost. I had stopped handing them my chair. After that, the days got quieter in a way that felt almost sacred. I made coffee in my smaller apartment near the clinic, sat by the window, and let the morning light find me without asking permission first. The furniture was mismatched. The walls were bare, and somehow it felt more like home than that house ever had. I started seeing how much energy I had spent shrinking myself, lowering my voice, leaving the best seat open eating, last saying it's fine when it never was. It's a strange thing realizing peace can feel awkward at first, like a new pair of shoes you haven't broken in yet. But my shoulders stopped living up around my ears, and I slept through the night for the first time in years. I still loved Sarah. That part never became simple. But I no longer confused love with surrender, and I no longer called it kindness when I was really disappearing. That was the real change. Not that I became harder. I became honest. I kept the records, kept the boundaries, kept the life I built with my own hands and my own name on it. And every time I sat down at my table without apologizing for taking up space, I felt the same quiet truth settle in me. I'd spent too long waiting for a place to be offered when I should have taken my seat back myself. So if someone you loved kept treating your presence like an inconvenience, kept making you feel like you had to earn the right to sit there, would you keep folding yourself smaller the way I did? Or would you finally do what I did and take your seat back?